We're going to let everybody come into the room, so we'll get started in about 30 seconds to 1 minute. All right, we will get started. So, thank you for attending our monthly webinar on by Gray Associates for demand for higher education programs. As always, a couple housekeeping things to start with. At the bottom of your screen, there is a raise hand button, a Q&A button, and a chat button. I will be monitoring both. We prefer if you put questions into the Q&A side of things. That way other people can see them and upvote them. Chats, anything for comments, stuff like that. We always like to hear feedback. And then also, if you would like to speak, even we possibly can raise your hand if you can't get your chat button to work. Today we'll be looking at results through May. And without further ado, I will hand it over to author and CEO, Bob Atkins.
Thank you very much, Ned. And today I'm joined by Wanel Oriak, who runs our customer success. And he'll be chiming in from time to time with his perceptions on the issues that we're looking at, especially when we get to our program of the month. So without further ado, I'm Bob Atkins. I'm the CEO and founder here at Gray Associates and the very proud parent of Stop, Start, or Grow, my new book that just came out. Well, it's not even a month old yet on Amazon. So I'll keep plugging that every 30 seconds through the entire webinar. I am kidding, kind of. But let's take a look at what's actually happening in the marketplace these days. So before I do that, apologies. I think I'll just introduce Gray for those of you who don't already know us. We consult entirely to higher education institutions. Today, you'll see our market and financial data that we bring to bear to help clients do something we call program evaluation. And I believe we have the only extant program evaluation system. And you'll see the richness that we believe is required to have a program evaluation system, as opposed to many of the components that are sold elsewhere. You know, labor market data systems are interesting, but they're not program evaluation systems. They're labor market systems. They only report on one part of the equation. Our systems, in contrast, include student demand, competition, demographics, employment data, sure is important, skills and wages, benchmarks from other institutions, including financial benchmarks, and we understand academic economics so that we can help clients understand which programs produce margin and which programs need a margin in order to sustain themselves. We've brought a lot of advanced analytic tools to bear on this, both in creating our data sets and also in some of our ancillary services. Our primary service is program evaluation software, and that includes data, as I mentioned, on markets economics, as well as the dashboards needed to manage to manage programs. We do pricing work as well and help people understand the elasticity of price, how to structure it, and how to optimize it, and how to optimize their scholarship spending as well. One of the things we find missing when we look at that is most people don't understand their cost by program, and therefore they don't understand their margin by student. And without that, it's hard to know how much of a scholarship to offer, and whether you're in effect offering up all the margin on that program in the scholarship, or if you're looking at a different program, you might not be offering enough. And finally, we do work on location or place, whether that's geo-targeting or site selection. Now let's talk about the marketplace. Google Trends is one of our sources. We now track search volumes for over 900 programs, 15 to 20 keywords each. These programs comprise over 90% of all US completions, so our view is pretty comprehensive data. And we've been tracking it over time. And we continue to curate the data sets and clean up the keywords and so forth to try and make it as representative as possible of what a student might search for when they're looking for programs. And I have very good news, which is long in coming. It looks to us as though demand for academic programs is increasing at double-digit rates, up 18% year over year in May. So I hope that's going to play through the funnel and end up in enrollment at your colleges. Obviously, all of them watching these decline through COVID and prior. It is really nice to see the market start to bounce back, and I hope it, as I say, continues to flow through to enrollment. What are people searching for? So let's focus really. The top programs are fairly well known: business, nursing, nursing assistant. A surprise here: It's consistent in our data, but I don't think many people are aware that cosmetology is actually one of the most sought after programs. And then we see nursing again, bus driver, bus and truck driver, I should say. Obviously, a huge need right now with all the backup and logistics. Though I think if you look out 10 years, automation is going to overtake that space. But that 10 years is a long time for most of us. And I think there'll be interest in that program and need for the drivers for a while now. Social work, computer science, accounting, and culinary or chef training. These are the things students most frequently look for. But that is changing fairly rapidly. And you'll see this through the rest of the presentation. Data analytics is just booming. Cybersecurity, same thing. And if we take that data analytics, you'll see that it crops up in several different ways in other throughout the presentation. Marketing management up 113%, game design up 112%. And by the way, lest you feel like, oh, well, games is a relatively small industry, which it isn't anymore, but I can understand that point of view. And there are not going to be enough jobs writing software for my graduates. There are a lot of applications of game and media design well outside of gaming. For example, many of these graduates will get hired into architecture firms where they'll help to develop the virtual walkthroughs of buildings as they're designed and sold to clients. So there is actually opportunity there. Insurance, I am not sure who is interested in going into insurance, but God bless them. Homeland security, sales distribution, and it's very interesting to see these two aviation fields starting to crop up in our systems.
Bob, we got a quick question.
Sports and fitness management. Go ahead.
Do we have any research about the irony of increased search but continued enrollment declines?
You're talking about leading and lagging indicators. And I think a little bit of soul searching that higher ed needs to do. So our Google volume is a leading indicator. Those students won't show up to school. Best case, they're interested and they actually approach a school and get in for this fall. But more likely that they begin their search well in advance of they're actually, for example, applying to school. So Google is a leading indicator. Enrollment is a second layer in the funnel, and we'll come to that in just a second. And then finally, you have completions, which are years out of date, but because they represent decisions that were made years before graduation. So think of it that way. Google's telling you what's coming, and enrollment tells you what's actually happened. Now, the other problem, I think, is that we haven't done a good job in higher ed of doing programmatic marketing. Most of my clients, and I'm not a marketer, so I may be a little bit off base here, but when I talk to clients, they primarily do brand marketing. Not that you shouldn't do brand marketing, but if you're doing brand marketing and somebody's searching for cybersecurity, you are not going to show up, and you're going to leave those students aside. So be very careful that you're actually marketing and communicating in the fields where there's growth. I think we spent way too much time in higher ed worried about jobs, forgetting, and I shouldn't say it quite that way. Jobs are important, but if we don't pay attention to who wants to come to school and what do they want to do, why do you expect enrollment to go up? It's really that basic. And I think it's particularly true in the two-year college space, community colleges, where we really have spent a lot of time trying to make sure our graduates will get jobs, but we haven't spent nearly as much time trying to figure out how to get students to come to school and what messages are going to get the underserved students to campus. What messages are going to get guys to come to campus? Which programs do we need to emphasize to attract them? And if you don't pay attention and communicate to potential students in languages that they resonate with, about topics they care about, they're not going to come. Okay, enough for my rant there. More good news. Again, perspective. This should flow into colleges coming up. I wouldn't expect this necessarily to be there now in terms of enrollment, but up 22% in terms of brand search for colleges. So as I mentioned, program search is one way people come at looking for college. The other way is they go looking for schools and they search by brand name. Oftentimes these two indicators are saying different things. It's one of the first times I've seen double-digit growth on both indicators. So it makes me optimistic. I just hope I'm not disappointed when the enrollment numbers come in a few months. International is not quite such a great story. It's kind of flat, down 2%. What are people looking for? We exclude the top 10 programs here, by the way, because they're kind of obvious. When we look at the second 10, you see biology, biological sciences leading, computer software, not a surprise. Education is a bit of a surprise to me that it's quite this large. And psychology, which is it's a very interesting example because it's actually one of the largest programs in the United States. But the outcomes don't look great, and it's not really heavily marketed usually. Probably a mistake. There's a program a lot of students are interested in, whether it's domestic or international. Informatics, marketing management, economics, and at the bottom there's civil engineering, which kind of fits my overly simplistic profile, but you see a lot of engineering and computers in the top 10. It's interesting to see these. I'm sorry, this is the top 10 in terms of what people are looking for. We normally do the second 10, and I crossed wires there, I apologize. But it's worthwhile taking a look at these and making sure that you're out there with a message that appeals to these very large groups of students by program. Now, where are those students?
We have a quick question. Are your Brandon program search results localized to a geographic region or zip code?
They are localized by geography. I believe it's by state. And then we do some work to figure out how to allocate those further down to actually census tracts. So it is geographically specific, and it's precisely accurate at the state level, and then it's estimated more granularly than that. Now, and by the way, we do that so that when we're working with a school, we can create custom market definitions for them and pull in the data that's directly related to the market they serve. You know, just because you're in a state doesn't mean you serve the entire state. And conversely, just because you're in one state doesn't mean you serve others. So you really need to be able to have data sets that reflect the markets you're really in. And by giving us such a granular level down at the tract level, which is actually more precise than a census tract, than a zip code, you know, you can really define your market in a very accurate way and get data that lines up with that. I am always surprised to see how high Iran ranks on this list. I suppose anyway, I would have thought there were more people who still thought of us as the great Satan, but apparently there's a fairly strong cadre of folks who would like to come out and go to Western colleges, in the US in particular. You can see Nigeria, 2 African countries here in 3rd and 4th, and then the UK, Pakistan, Nepal, and so forth. Where do they want to go? Everybody wants to go surfing. California is #1. You can see we've got some interest up here in the Northeast, a little bit of a decline going on towards the Midwest. Let's take a look at enrollment now. Somebody mentioned, you know, if Google search volume is up, why is enrollment down? And first, let's just look at what people are enrolled in. And it's business administration, registered nursing. Don't forget psychology is #3. So this is a program of great interest to a large number of students. And by the way, almost none of the students are going to go on to a career in psychology. The numbers there are around 3–4% will actually end up in something related to psychology. Most of those folks are going to go off and do something else. Now, it may still require skills from psychology, like consumer psychology and marketing, but it's not psychology per se. Then we have biology, computer science makes a list, criminal justice, accounting, mechanical engineering, finance, and marketing management. What's growing is quite different. First is people who have made up their mind, multidisciplinary studies. And then we have cybersecurity. I mentioned that we're going to see this again at the outset, and here it is. It's one of the fastest growing programs in terms of enrollment. Health services, allied health, econometrics, health and wellness general. Notice the focus on health is very common in large programs and growing programs. We've got public health here, and arguably exercise physiology is a health-related topic as well. So a lot of interest in programs related to health, or growing interest in programs related to health. And we see aerospace touching here again. By the way, education had been down for a long time. It's nice to see it growing again. Let's see. At the master's level, the story is similar, but not the same. Business is the largest master's program, if anybody's wondering. Almost 3 times as large as the next largest, which is registered nursing, again, in the top few. Social work is very large as well. Interesting challenge there in keeping the total debt that a person has to get in order to get through and get a master's in social work aligned with a pay in that field, but still very popular. Computer science, business analytics, I think is really interesting here. I think we're going to see a lot of trade-off between business administration and business analytics in terms of student enrollment. Education leadership, education general. You see really the bottom half here is all about education, education leadership, education general, special ed, school counseling, and arguably even a big chunk of public administration is really education related. What's growing? Behavioral sciences, business analytics. There's that data analytics coming to the fore again. Education, nursing, data modeling I mentioned was going to show up again in our growth numbers, and here it is. Then we get into, again, a lot of health, applied behavior analysis, health service administration, and nursing all up here amongst the fastest growers, nurse education, excuse me, amongst the fastest growers. Now, I think nursing education is really an interesting point because it's potentially a breakthrough. So we have for decades had a shortage of nurse educators, and it was a real constraint on the growth of nursing programs. Because of course they could make more money working as nurses than they could teaching. Now, with COVID, I think we have a lot of people who are exhausted and they just can't take the pressure that exists in our nursing system at this point. So I think they're looking to stay in the nursing field, but not in a hospital. And that to me is probably what's behind the spur and interest in nursing education, which in turn could solve the problem that we have in nursing schools of being able to attract qualified, experienced faculty. So this could be a real bright spot, I think, for schools, not just in teaching it, but in benefiting from the trend and the increase in interest in nursing education. And I'm interested to see this. We've started predicting this disaster management concept, 3 to 5 years ago. And now we're starting to see student interest spiking in that area. I find it very intriguing. It's conceptually obvious given all the disasters we've been through and the enormous complexity of managing a disaster, going into a city where the power's down, the water's not getting in, the streets aren't working. Where do you start? The hospital may be out, the schools are down. How do you begin to turn that community around and get it rebuilt is not a trivial topic, and it would require some genuine expertise. And sadly, given global warming, I think we're going to have an ever increasing need for people who understand how to manage complex disasters. So interesting to see a student demand start to come up for that.
Bob, we have a quick question. It's curious to see that supply chain management is not on these lists, particularly with the current issues and emphasis on it. Do you see interest increasing in that area?
We do, and increasing number of programs. There is increasing interest. There are a lot more jobs, but do keep it, and this is just the top 10, so you could be growing quite rapidly, anything up to 20%, and you wouldn't show up on this list. So no, it's a good program. It's a healthy program, generally speaking. The competition isn't toxic yet from the one when I've looked at it in various markets. So no, it's an interesting one to go after and to emphasize right now. But it's not the fastest growing. Now remember too, these are monthly numbers. So you'll want to keep track of this over time. Obviously, if you're in our systems, this data is available to you and you can go back and look and see exactly how supply chain's been doing. Wynell, why don't we tee that one up actually for our first example after I get through the core presentation. We're going to open the floor so you all can bring up ideas of programs you'd like to look at, and Wynell will actually pull those up and have a look at them. Good question on the size of these ends, and I don't know offhand. So again, something we can pull up and have a look at together. Employment trends. Shifts, so now we're looking at job markets. So while I do believe we need to increase the emphasis on student demand, that's not to say we need to decrease or underemphasize employment. It is a really important dimension of higher ed, making sure we're actually educating people for jobs that exist in the workplace. We're seeing a slight decline now in year-over-year data. Remember that the data from 2021 is artificially high because of the decline, the massive decline in employment that happened in 2020. The first quarter of 2020 actually had the largest decline in GDP, gross domestic product, in the history of the United States. So it's created an artificial depression in job postings. And so the numbers swelled in 2021. And now we're trying to anniversary numbers that were, well beyond normal highs. So being at 5 million job postings is not bad, actually, but it's a little bit less than last year. And if you care about inflation, we actually probably need this number to come down a little bit more. But it's hard for me to root against employment, even if it causes inflation. So what's hot and what's not on job postings? Registered nurses almost always lead this. And there are over 200,000 job postings for registered nurses, which is a very substantial portion of the entire population of registered nurses, which I think is an order of magnitude about 1.5 million. So we're looking at 10%, the equivalent of 10% of the workforce here, maybe more. General and operations managers, 109,000. Not a lot of, and I'm sorry, then we see nursing and health related cropping up again here. Medical equipment preparers, licensed practical nurses, nursing assistants. There's a huge shortage of people at the bedside in healthcare right now. MA is related. It's not really bedside. Those are the folks who, if you're at the doctor's office, they'll walk you into the room and take your blood pressure, as an example. But it's that field is increasing. And the last time I checked, the number of medical assistants graduating was down from a high of about 250,000 in, call it 2017, to about 50 or 60,000 now. So it's declined by 75%. We started to see a little bit of life in that program, but for your two-year colleges, that should be a bread and butter program. The employers need those folks, and it's relatively short. So it's a way for somebody who's out of work or wants to get from high school to a job quickly to do that. And then if they choose to progress up the ladder into more sophisticated healthcare roles, like nursing. Now, what's growing past this? It's obviously different from what's big. Medical records techs, not sure why that would be happening. IT project managers, not a big surprise. Loan officers, I guess it's a growth in mortgages and other loans as the housing market boomed. Finally, by the way, tax preparers has dropped off this, so tax season is officially over. They've been on this list for quite some time. Business ops specialists, and I highlighted two that I think are really intriguing here. Physician assistants and nurse practitioners. Now, these guys can solve a number of different problems in our healthcare system because it's a relatively short path and they have many of the same rights and privileges, scope of practice, as full-fledged doctors. Now, not all of those things can be done, but if you take a particular aspect of this, which is you can be a specialist as a physician assistant or a nurse practitioner in psychology. And as a nurse practitioner, that allows you to prescribe medications. And I believe this is one of the few approaches that could actually solve our need for adequate mental health care. We cannot create psychiatrists fast enough to address that issue. And we do need people who can distribute meds to, for example, depressives to get their serotonin reuptake inhibitors and so forth. So in order to address the healthcare crisis, I think we're going to need more and more folks at relatively junior levels who can carry a larger part of the burden for healthcare, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of level of scope of practice. Keep going. Now we're going to switch over and look at courses that non-degree courses. So these are not part of an academic program. Now we're looking at Coursera. Many of our clients want to know what should we be doing about courses or certificates and non-degree programs. And the best source of data we've found on this is to look at Coursera and Udemy. And then from data that they post in their sites, we can derive both the number of students who've taken their programs over time, the number who've taken them recently, and how that's changing over time. So this chart is best read from left to right. So 3% approximately of all of the people who take Udemy courses over time have taken machine learning. That's coming down a little bit. You can see it's slightly below the line. So in May, there's a little bit less than 3% of students who took machine learning programs. So you could argue that it's slowing down a tinge, but not much. If it's on the line, then the past size is consistent with the current size. Below the line, The current size is a little bit smaller, i.e. the program is losing share of students on Udemy. I love this is Coursera, excuse me. I love this data because the things that are side by side are really interesting. Machine learning and the science of well-being. Learning how to learn in that top group. Programs for everybody. So there's a sort of alternate between self-improvement and coding. And then you start to see some things here that I think are foreigners looking for jobs in English-speaking countries, English for career development, for example, and an interest in languages, First Step Korean, Chinese for beginners. Here's another one of the sort of personal development, successful negotiation, COVID, of course, excuse me. And then a couple of other more foundational courses. First, Data Everywhere is an introduction to data science. And here we see also an introduction to psychology, and then a rack of more technical programs, especially around data science, neural networks, algorithms. So that's just a beginning of what's big out there. Now I'm going to take a look at one of those, Data Everywhere, and it teaches 5 skills according to Coursera. And all those skills are present, but they're not equally important when you start thinking about it from a job perspective. And I was a little bit surprised to see exactly how this stacked up. If you had asked me, I would have guessed that data analysis would be top of this list, and that spreadsheets would certainly be well represented. In fact, data analysis is third, and it's third by kind of a long way. The top of the list is data visualization. Very hot topic now. What I found interesting too, though, is I would have thought that'd be being done in Excel primarily, and it looks like spreadsheets aren't really the critical issue here from a job posting standpoint. SQL, structured query language, or SQL, it's often called, second biggest. And that's just basically that SQL is how you pull data out of databases. You can also use it to organize databases and so forth. But if you're trying to understand data in a large corporation, for example, the first tool you need is SQL. So you can extract the data from systems, combine it in certain ways, and then visualize it. And then data analytics, as I say, distant third, and data cleansing is fourth. It's kind of ironic because if you look at 80% of the work that a data scientist does, it's not over here in data analysis. It's not in SQL. It's not in data visualization. It's cleaning up all that ugly data and all the stuff that happens in there that means that if you don't clean it up, your visualizations and analysis are going to be incorrect. So this is where data scientists actually spend all their time. Then let's take a look at the top 16 to 30 courses, next tranche down. And you see what is data science there. So, and growing really fast. So I think there's a little bit here of people who want to get into the game, but don't really even know what the game is. And so it's not a big program yet. It's way over on the left-hand side of the chart, but it is growing pretty quickly. Google Cloud, fundamentals of graphic design, a fast growing one here, speak English professionally. Against probably international students who want to learn English so that they can be more effective in their business life. Bitcoin still hot, don't know why, honestly. If there's ever been a bunch of snake oil sold to the world, it's got to be Bitcoin. But I suppose I'm perhaps, there are a lot of people who disagree with me, I guess is a short way. And by the way, I would distinguish Bitcoin from the underlying technology of Bitcoin, which is a distributed ledger. That has a lot of applications and will have value over time. Bitcoin is really just a matter of what people, it's worth whatever people think it is. And that can change very quickly, including zero. And then we can see Python data structures here at the top, AI for everyone. So if you're wondering, data and AI are still amongst the hottest things out there. And there are a couple of our programming here in the middle. Now let's switch over to Udemy. Now in Udemy, we've done something consciously here. We've cut out all the tech categories. Now we do that, we were cutting out most of what's taught in Udemy. We've kind of already touched on that. And from time to time, we'll go back and look at those categories. But when you exclude tech, language learning is up there. I find this really interesting given the decline in language enrollment in most colleges over the last 10 years. But it's actually a pretty big program in terms of what people are interested in these online programs. Online courses, they're not programs. Graphic design, entrepreneurship, design tools, going back to the graphic design again, investing and trading, game development, And I don't find a lot of threads through here in terms of, things that you see 3 or 4 times that all represent some common theme. It's pretty random in terms of what people are interested in, as far as I can tell. What's growing fast? People understanding how to do Google search advertising, paid advertising, home improvement, design thinking. Again, a pretty random set of things as you go down here that students are interested in. I do think this poses a challenge for colleges and universities and community colleges trying to offer these, because it's such an eclectic list, theme that you can get behind and get most of the market, if you will, in your area, because the market seems to be all over the place in terms of what people are interested in. I should say, remember, that's excluding tech. If there is a theme that works, it's courses and certifications in specific data-related technical skills, coding, analysis, visualization, and so forth. Now, program portfolio analysis. I mentioned at the outset that that's really what we do, and we have what we believe is the only, I'll call it program evaluation system. Now, when I say system, I don't mean software. In order to have a system, you have to have the right data. It has to be embodied in the right software to make it easy to use and fast to access. But as importantly, a program evaluation system has to enable the right people to participate in the right process in order to make decisions. Now, in terms of what data you need in an evaluation system, you've got to have information on your mission, most likely contributed by your faculty, and how any given program relates to that mission. You need to know how it's doing academically. Is everybody getting a D, an F, or a W? If so, that's a problem. And by the way, you also need to look at DEI when you're doing this and see if that program is actually attracting the kinds of students you want to have on campus, or is it skewing towards one demographic or another, that's unintentionally exacerbating your DEI issues on campus. Margins, you do need to know which programs make money and which don't, in order to understand how you can subsidize the courses and programs that don't. And finally, money comes from markets. And within markets, we believe you need to know 4 things. Do students want this? In other words, what's student demand? What do employers want? Again, important, but not the only thing. Degree fit and competition. Is this market saturated? And I like to make a distinction between competition and saturation, because all education markets these days are competitive, but most are actually not saturated when you look at the data and try and discern whether somebody could grow or enter a space. Oftentimes they can, even though there are plenty of other people already in it. So let's pick an individual program here. I'm going to take mechanical engineering. It scores very well. Now we're looking at national level data. And we've got a 99th percentile score overall. So compared to the 1,400 other programs that are in our program evaluation software, this is in the top 1%, or about 14 of the best 14 of those programs. Student demand at the 99th percentile. Competitive intensity, not so great. A lot of folks offer this program, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But employment is also terrific. And I think we've known that there's good employment for mechanical engineers for decades. The surprises to me is that the student demand is there now. And we've got more people who want to take this program. So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, one more thing. You do have to be careful when you're doing program evaluation. Most of us do it one program at a time. And there are 1,400 other programs here. You could well be looking at one that scores an 89. And yeah, it would be a good program. Student demand might be good, competition might be okay, employment might be good. And you think, well, we should go ahead and do this. What you might be overlooking is the 20 or 30 other programs that are better that you could have done. And the difference between good and better when you're talking about programs is often a multiple of 10, i.e. the best program you could do maybe 10 times as big, 10 times as attractive as one that's just good. And so one program at a time, to me, is a fundamentally flawed way of analyzing a program, because you have no context. You don't understand what your alternatives are. You really can't even interpret much of the data, because you look at a given number and you don't really know if that number is big or small compared to other programs. So we do a lot of work to help with that. And by the way, that particular question is one that I didn't think up. I ran across it in a very awkward way. And this color coding helps. I'll tell the story after I explain it. But When things are good, at the 98th percentile, they'll be dark green in our systems. When they're weak, 40th percentile or below in that ranking versus 1,400 other programs, they're going to be in pink. So you can think green is good, pink is bad, and in between is in between, with obviously the yellow being a little bit worse. 70th percentile, about the mean in blue. So why do we do this? Well, when we very first had data on student demand, the equivalent of our Google search data now, I was so excited. And I sat down in front of a client and I said, look, this program has, I'll make up a number, 1,200 Google searches. And I thought that was pretty cool to know that it had 1,200 Google searches. And then the client looked back at me and said, well, is that a lot or a little? And I realized I had no idea how that compared, whether 1,200 searches was enough to fill a classroom or whether no one would show up, that only 1 in 1,000 searches actually turns into a student. I just didn't know. And that's where we began to use percentiling so that you could understand how this program compares to other programs, not just on overall, but for each metric. So as an example, we get into mechanical engineering, we look at enrollment volume, it's almost 15,000 students enrolled. That is the 99th percentile. So that's a lot of students nationally. Look at Google search volumes, not as high, only the 66th percentile. But here's a good example, 97,590 Google searches. If you'd asked me without seeing the percentile, I would not have had any way of telling you whether that was a lot or a little. And even if I knew nationally, I couldn't possibly know in all of your individual markets. So that percentiling concept is very important. The colors are important too, because they allow you to look at this stuff and grasp it immediately, especially if you're like me and you're a history major and you really get tired of looking at a blizzard of numbers. You can glance down this and very quickly pick out where it's strong. Green, green, dark green, dark green. Those are all my strong areas. My completion volume is up. My on-ground and non-completions are at the 99th. This is a big program with a high degree of certainty. All my indicators are suggesting that it's big, except Google search. And even there, it's okay. Then I look at growth. And again, I can see that in terms of enrollment and completions, growth is very healthy. Google search year over year is very good. It's not quite as high, but it's the 85th percentile. And then we start to look at the percentage change, and all these are above average. So for a very large program to be growing at an above average rate, it's really quite good. And here, while the Google search volume we saw up top was a little low, the change is actually pretty robust at 7% growth in volume for this particular program. Where is it cool? Enrollment, from an enrollment standpoint, the highest level of enrollment for this particular program is in California. We can see a little bit of a drop here. These are percentage growth. The colors indicate the absolute amount of students, and a little bit of a pattern here through the West. Actually, interesting, not a lot in the Northeast, and a bit of a decline here in what I would have thought would be a hotbed for mechanical engineering in Michigan. Now let's turn to employment, things about employment data that are worth remembering. Job postings is the most current indicator, and probably the most robust indicator. Now the question then becomes, okay, I've got this job posting. How can I tell if it's related to this particular program? And underneath that sits a crosswalk. And for this direct prep stuff, we use what's called the NCES crosswalk primarily to inform that number. It's a very, I'll call it narrow-minded way of looking at what people do. And we'll come to that in a minute. But it does sort of identify those things where if you were trying to say, what is a mechanical engineer trained to do, it picks out those fields specifically. And so it's good for that purpose of understanding, okay, I taught you mechanical engineering, you probably should become a mechanical engineer. Even though, by the way, most people don't. You can see down here, the percent in direct prep jobs, 37% of mechanical engineers end up in a job for which they're directly prepared, i.e. being a mechanical engineer. So just remember, that's actually a very high percentage. You might think 37% is low, but out of our 1,400 programs, 900 of those have direct prep percentages of less than 20%. So by and large, people don't do what they're supposed to do. They go off and do other things. And when I say by and large, I mean more than 90% of the time, they're not going to go in the field for which they're directly prepared. The big exception is nursing. We also have BLS here, current employment, interesting number, pretty reliable number. Annual job openings, interesting, not as reliable because it depends on the BLS forecast. We just finished backtesting the BLS forecast. 80% of those forecasts are off by 50% or more. So if you're depending on that BLS forecast to make program decisions about what fields you should get into because they're growing, that number is not reliable. It's not even a little bit reliable. If you look at just whether the BLS says it's growing, does it actually grow? BLS is no more accurate than a coin toss. So if you want to know whether it's what your growing fields are and you're thinking about using BLS, you may as well just take a coin out and flip it. It will give you the answer with approximately the same accuracy. Unfortunately, the trends aren't a great indicator either. So if this boils down to, it is extremely difficult to forecast the future of labor markets. I'm not aware of anybody who does it well. And I think what you have to do is be nimble and try and adapt to things as they arise, because you're not really going to be able to predict that 3 to 5 years in the future. Or said slightly differently, your judgment about what's going to grow is probably as good an indicator as anything. The other thing is, things that are big are likely to be big and are likely to have a lot of job openings. So I would look at size as the primary indicator of whether there are going to be jobs in your area, not the trend. And then we can see job postings per graduate, which is a good measure of the relative saturation of the job market. 3.6, we're not saturated. That's 3.6 job postings for every graduate in this program. Pretty good number. And that's a 69th percentile. And you notice the BLS job openings per graduate, that's dependent on the BLS forecast. Much, much lower would tell you that it's saturated. It isn't. So be careful with the BLS the numbers that depend on the forecasts. We still report them because our clients want to know, but I have a lot of concerns about their accuracy. And then you can see wage data. Now let's get to the interesting part of this, which is to look at a little bit in terms of what the trend is, and then I'll come to what do people really do. In terms of job posting volumes, again, that huge spike last year, it's starting to taper off a little bit, down 13% year over year in May, but again, pretty high level compared to the historical data prior to 2021. Job postings for mechanical engineering, what do they really want? Interesting, it's project coordinators, which is not intrinsically an engineering job, though it does require engineering skills. You can see project engineer, manufacturing engineer, quality engineer, and so forth down the list. But then you get to this other problem of, do people actually become engineers when they graduate from us and get a degree in mechanical engineering? So in a very narrow-minded way, NCES looks at this and says, here are the jobs you should have. They align it with 5 SOC codes. And then mechanical engineers actually decide they're going to go into 463 other fields, which is kind of a lot. It's 100 times more fields than the crosswalk says it should be. So keep that in mind. Most systems and analyses that look at labor markets make this assumption that people are going to go into fields for which they're directly prepared. Many of those analyses and labor market data suppliers use that crosswalk, the NCES crosswalk, to tell you how many jobs are available for folks coming out of that. The only problem is there are 100 times more jobs than they tell you about, which is kind of a big miss. So you really do need to use the American Community Survey data, hard data from the census, to understand what do people really do and how many jobs are there in those fields, not just in the fields that labor market economists think these folks should go into. And I found this interesting. Of course, mechanical engineers, pretty good slug go into mechanical engineering, miscellaneous engineering, but not surprising, a lot end up as managers. We've got civil engineers, industrial engineers, aerospace engineers, architectural engineers, but don't ignore chief executives and business and operations specialists are in the top 10. So like everybody else, people learn a toolkit, and over time they may learn other applications for that toolkit, or simply want to explore other areas and have other skills that they can apply. So I think engineering is a hugely helpful skill to have in almost any field, but certainly in management, it's really, really useful. whether or not you're actually doing engineering per se. Now comes the problem, which is competition. And not surprisingly, we've got a whole bunch of folks who have these programs. 356 institutions across the country offer mechanical engineering. That's at the 97th percentile, so it's one of the 30 most offered programs in the United States. Campuses with grads, year-over-year change, 10. So some people got into this field, which is, given how many people are in it already, is a little bit disappointing. That's why you see it in pink here. Institutions with online in-market students, just 4. This program really hasn't taken off online. If I look down here at the bottom at national online percent of institutions, only 1% of institutions have offered it online, and that's about 1% of completions. So it's not that students have, I think when you look at those numbers, it's not that students have said, I don't want to go to an online program. It's that actually nobody's offering an online program in this field. And there are probably lab requirements and so forth that make it challenging. But in general, most of those lab requirements can be overcome with specialized toolkits, and/or this may be a program that can be taught partially online with an on-ground component. By the way, if it were taught that way, it would still show up in here in online, the way the data is reported. So that's not even happening. So if I looked at this, I'd say there may be an opportunity to shift and begin teaching at least a hybrid program in this, especially if you have an older student, somebody's, got part of an undergraduate degree and wants to finish up, may by now have a family, has a job, can't really come to class every day, but you could arrange for them to be able to take a lab and do the rest of it online. There are some signs that this thing is getting saturated. Now, first for the good news, these are very big programs. Average program completions in the country, 106. The median is still 78. But when I talk about saturation, we've got a -4 here in terms of number of completions in the median school. So that is a warning sign to me that the people who offer this program are starting to have trouble filling their classes. And then Google cost per click is very worrisome at the 90th percentile. That means a whole bunch of folks are competing and bidding up the cost of a click for the terms associated with engineering. So that would give me pause. This looks like a pretty saturated field, probably not one I'd want to get in. And if I have a big program, I'd want to be thinking about how I defend that against an increasing level, high level of competition. Now, degree fit. That basically means what degree level is appropriate for this program, and is that a degree level that's relevant at your campus. This appears to be pretty much a center of the plate bachelor's program, whether that's looking at national completions, 80th percentiles, 80% of the graduates are at the bachelor's level, the markets at the 80th percentile, enrollment in the market, 86% of the people enrolled are actually at the bachelor's level. A little bit of master's presence, not a lot at the doctoral level, but doctorate is always a relatively small percentage just by the nature of the degree and how advanced it is and how much time it takes to get it. So we see the 52-24-5 here on the side in terms of on that what people have in terms of degrees who are already in the workforce. Again, lion's share at the bachelor's level, but master's is still pretty well represented. Then we take all those colors and percentiles and data and put them together on one page. Now, I know this is a busy page, but it really is helpful to decision makers to be able to look at this one page and know that they've looked at almost all the data that you need to know in order to evaluate this program and decide whether to start, stop, or grow the program. Now, that's very different than deciding what to teach in the program, very different than deciding whether the program is being taught well. I use the word assessment for that purpose. Evaluation is more about whether I should offer this program, and again, whether it has the opportunity to grow, or whether it's just one I want to sustain. So keep those two things a little bit separate in your mind between evaluation, should I offer this and how much, and assessment, which is how do I do it and am I doing it well? So let me summarize for you. Good news, Google search volume is up 18% year over year in May. Again, a leading indicator, so we hope that's going to come rippling through to you later on in terms of enrollment. Search for college brands is also up 22%. Again, unusual to see those two metrics synchronized, and really great to see them both up around 20%. The fastest growing program was large, I could call it undeclared, multidisciplinary studies, and at the master's level is behavioral sciences. I think you saw registered nurses and nursing in general ticked in almost every field, whether it's in terms of size and growth. And we have that one really interesting change in nurse educators or people interested in nursing education that I think could be very helpful going forward. And rapid growth in medical records technicians, generally people work in hospitals trying to make sure that your bill gets done on time. Demand for mechanical engineering, the bachelor's level is high, but the competition is really strong here. So this is a program where if I had it, as I say, I would defend it carefully because it's a very competitive space. And remember that whether it's mechanical engineering or almost any other program, people have a lot more job options, fields that they can go into than they're typically given credit for. So be careful that we don't reiterate and communicate these very artificial categories and job volumes that people tend to use now that are built off this direct prep concept. It's just not correct. And it's, by the way, when you get to things like the liberal arts or psychology, it's massively incorrect. Only 3 or 4% of people in liberal arts are going to go on into fields for which are directly prepared. So you really need to have that American Community Survey data so you know what people really do, and you can look and see how many jobs there are in those fields. So let me stop. I'm going to turn it over to Anel and fire it up, Anel, and we'll actually give you guys a chance to ask about any programs you'd like to see, and we'll pull them up at the national level and have a look.
Bob, real quickly before we do that, we have one question. Do we know if multidisciplinary studies year-over-year growth is more driven by degree completers returning to school, or is it undecided majors?
Don't believe we know that yet. I think one of the things we haven't, our data supplier on that, we haven't asked them for demographics on enrollment. I think we're remiss in that, and we will be getting after it over the next few weeks. So check back in. And we'll have a look and see what the demographics are for not only that program, but all programs. Histotechnology in the Midwest/National. I'm pretty sure that's not a zip code. So I don't think we're going to be able to pull that up. Do you see anything? If you can describe a little bit what that is, maybe there's a related zip code we could have a look at.
I see histologic technician.
They're looking for supply chain management too, like we said at the beginning as well.
Yeah, let's do that first. That's big.
I have supply chain management, and I also have a hospitality management in my notes here.
Let's look at supply chain management first. And EK, if you could give us a description of histotechnology, we'll figure out whether we can find a zip code that's close.
And also, Bob, real quick question. Do we offer training on the direct prep and ACS data? I understand the narrowness of NCES, but I've never heard of the ACS.
American Community Survey is a subset of the US Census. They ask about 2.5 million people what they majored in as an undergraduate, what they're currently doing as a job, and they do that by occupation, and what their pay level is. So that gives you real data at the bachelor's level about what people do with a given degree. And again, here you can see direct prep on logistics. 21%, a fifth of the people who go into this field actually who study in this field end up going in and doing work that's supposedly they're directly prepared for. But it's very solid data. It's a huge survey. It's census level accuracy, so it's reliable in a way that I'm not aware of any other data set that could give you that kind of insight. I do be aware, though, it doesn't really answer the question for community college or for a master's degree. I think on the community college side, for your transfer programs, the ACS data is a valid indicator because those people are going to go on and try and get a 4-year degree. For your trades programs, my suspicion is that linkage between what I study and what I do is probably much tighter than it is for a bachelor's degree. But I don't know for sure, honestly.
And I'm actually going to spend some time in some of the new tabs that we have available in our system, these overview tabs, just because we're getting a lot of requests and we don't have that much time. So keep in mind that there's a lot of underlying data that feeds these overview tabs that we're looking at. But I think the overview is going to be able to speak to some of the trends that you all are looking to see in a little bit of a quicker fashion. So for something like logistics, material, and supply chain, when I'm looking at the student demand section here, for the student demand metrics that we collect, we can see that there's no question, there's a huge amount of student interest in terms of the size of the volume related to the metrics that we track. Any question, if there's any question at all here, would lie in the growth. And I suspect that just because the size is already so large, the growth isn't going to be reflected as strongly as maybe a smaller program growing. So I don't see any alarms here in terms of the growth being at the 59th percentile, which again, it might look a little scary because it's yellow and not this beautiful green color, but it's still above average here. Similarly with employment, we're seeing a lot of strong employment in terms of size and growth related to logistics and material and supply chain. If there's any types of questions that we would want to dive into, it would probably be related to the wages. So I'd be curious about what kind of jobs are being brought into this relationship between occupation and zip code, and how is that translating into overall wages. And then finally,
remember that in supply chain, you're going to have a blend of supply chain management when you look at jobs and people working in warehouses. So that's going to, the way the data is assembled, you're going to be mixing those two together. Essentially, people who might have a college degree and be going into management, and people who are picking things off the shelf.
And then if there's any alarming here at all, it would probably take place in, how can I, what can I learn about this competitive intensity section here? We can see that there's a lot of volume, right? So there's a lot of different people, different institutions in this game right now. It's a very large program. So that's something that you definitely want to consider, if this is a program that you don't already offer. And then really quickly, we can see most of the completions here are happening at the bachelor's level with some master's level completions. And then kind of to what Bob was alluding to in terms of the types of jobs that are being looped in here into the zip code, we can see that there's a lot of some college, no college, right, related to that supply chain management materials side of things. But despite that, we still see some strong bachelor's level holders in this market. Okay. Are we comfortable moving forward away from this, or should we dive in deeper?
I'm a little bit curious on the wages, just what are they? And maybe let's look at the ACS wage, because that's going to be a pure view of what people who went to college get, where the BLS wage is going to be averaging the non-college graduates with the college graduates.
Yeah, so we can see the difference here, right? The direct prep relationship would show here in the BLS, where that mean wage is looking like a 65,000 for the mean wages related to the BLS crosswalk. When we're looking at the ACS data, we're going to go ahead and look at this 30 to 60 as an equivalent to kind of the mean, more tenured wage. And we're looking at almost
over $100,000,
but a lot more money here in this case.
Right.
Then we have things like hospitality management. Really quickly, hospitality management is going to be not a tricky one, but just keep in mind that at the 2-digit level, there's going to be a lot of different niche categorizations of this program further that relate back to this hospitality general. So keep in mind, we do house our data at the zip code level. So there could be a lot of overlap between, these 01s, 03s, 04s, all the way down to these 99s. So if we wanted to look at this program, we might want to take a step back into the program rank view and consider how all of these programs are performing. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and select that 01, which is the most general, and then dive into this overview tab here. And keep in mind, we do have these overviews here just to make it a lot easier to digest the data. What we want to do is kind of show you the indicators, right? The indicators are going to make you ask questions and wonder, well, why is this growth at a 34th percentile? Why is this size volume of student demand at the 95th? And we can kind of work our way over into the next tab to identify the actual metrics that are driving these outcomes here, right? But really quickly, for hospitality management, student demand size, very large, right? If there's any questions, it would be, what's the growth related to some of these metrics that we see in student demand here at the 34th percentile? Same with size of employment. So we see a lot of interest. We see a lot of jobs. How are these jobs paying? Would be one of the questions that I see just from this overview. Competitive intensity, lots of institutions in this game nationally, right? 94th percentile volumes. And we're going to see that most of these award levels most of these completions are being issued here at the bachelor's level, 66% completions at the bachelor's level. And we can see a need for bachelor's levels credentials in the workforce currently, where 30% of those people working in this field.
Yeah, this is another one though. There are, about 50% of people don't have any degree at all.
Yep.
So let's go look at the wage, same split. Let's look at the wages from ACS and not ACS, BLS, to see how that breaks down. Interestingly, here it's quite a different story, right? The college graduates are making about $77,000, $78,000. Actually, the average, the BLS person, which would include non-college graduates, is at 69. So there isn't that disparity we saw before.
And I know we see a bunch of other programs here, like behavioral analysis. Really quickly, I do want to just jump into that Homeland Security one, just to really quickly show you the degree fit, and it might be able to help with understanding the award level. You know, is there a need for this at the graduate level? Are other people doing this at the graduate level? Really quickly, with just a click, I can go ahead and just show you that overview, and we'll be able to see that, you know, 44% of all the completions here are happening at the bachelor's level, 29% at the master's, which is, you know, I would say there is somewhat of a need at the graduate level. But keep in mind that the employment market, you know, similar to the other programs that we were looking at, don't necessarily show the same type of need, right?
Yeah, do you know what's going on here, Winnell, that I hear about in Homeland Public Security is, first of all, in general, way too many people want to carry a gun and boss people around. And so the student demand relative to the number of jobs as policemen, for example, is, you know, way skewed. There are a lot more students than there are jobs. The master's level degree is typically going to be somebody who's working in the field, who wants to move up into management or a higher level in management, be a police chief, for example. And for them, that degree is actually quite useful. But they're not looking for a job. They're looking to move up. So in that sense, they're not competing in the external job market as one might expect for a different kind of program.
And I'm not sure if the person that asked a question about this Histo technology is still here, but we can quickly see some overviews here for that program. Looks like the student demand is relatively flat here at the 50th percentile, but we do see some significant growth in those metrics. So I'd be curious about that.
Let's for this one, let's drop to the scorecard and look at it in detail.
Cool.
It's you're the first person that's ever asked about this program, by the way. So kudos to you.
There could be no data.
Yeah, not a lot on student demand. Jobs. So let's start with jobs. So if students knew about this, and my guess is most don't. So you know, that's why you don't see any student demand. It's not that students don't want to do it. It's that they probably don't even know it exists. Job postings are low, right? 36th percentile. Growth in employment is low. Not actually, no, it's not fair. It's about average. It's above average, 79th, 65th. Again, job postings per graduate is actually quite high, which says there may be a shortage. The wages are not great, though. I'm a little bit surprised they're so low.
Yeah, I'd be curious what jobs are being related to this field.
Well, we're looking at tech right now. So that anytime you see the word tech in a job, in a program title, it's usually geared towards a 2-year program and towards a technician, not a, for example, a doctorate in science that might be doing this and really studying the tissues per se, as opposed to preparing the tissue for study.
Yeah,
I think really what's going on here is this program, by and large, doesn't exist. There are only 4 programs in the country. So if I wanted to, first of all, I would go back to my original comment of, you know, this may be in fact a good program if you were creative and you knew how to market it and you could attract students. But chances are there's a better program you could be going after that's larger and would contribute more to your institution. I always say that with the assumption that most institutions need more revenue in order to improve their financials. If that's not the case, then, and you have other motivations for launching programs, then, you know, you may well be interested in something like this that's more of a niche. Maybe you can establish a presence and a reputation there.
Real quickly, Ike, thanks for your sending this program to us, and I just saw that you are from a community college. Next month, we will be launching a specifically targeted community college demand trends webinar. The email will be going out shortly, so I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. That just focusedly looks a lot on student demand, employment, and competition for the community college sector.
Kishore, interesting question, which is, do you have data at this level for quantum computing yet? Actually, we do have the data. It's not in this particular system, but we can get the data at almost this level for quantum computing. We would go and do that custom. There's no zip code for quantum yet, so we don't have it all coded up in our system the way we would for other programs. But it's a really interesting one. We've been talking about that for 2 or 3 years as a potentially hot field. There's an interesting article that McKinsey just published saying the constraint is going to be talent. That we're not, and I think we can work around that because we will have a constrained number of people who can actually build a quantum computer. God only knows who can figure out how to handle quantum physics. It's one of those subjects that makes no sense to me. But actually, I think we get people to write software. We can teach them to do that because it's not, you don't actually have to deal with the concept of quantum physics in order to write software that runs on a quantum computer. So I think that's an interesting place to play. And by the way, you can now run quantum computing algorithms and so forth on computers that you can lease time on. So this isn't completely future stuff. There are applications now, there are computers you can run them on, and there's some really exciting technology trends here. There are people who allege to have created desktop quantum computers in Australia in particular. They somehow encapsulated quantum particles in diamonds, believe it or not. And so they've got it, not just the ability to do it, but the ability to do it in a very small form factor, and at millions of dollars less cost. I mean, these systems right now, require cryogenic down at the level of near absolute zero in order to create quantum events that then drive the computer. So it'll be interesting to watch that space. Not a lot of programs there yet. All right, thanks everybody. That's our program for this month. Very much appreciate your joining us. Don't forget to buy the book and have a structure for thinking about program evaluation. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next month.